first of all, thank you and welcome to this third installment in basically the Innovating UCLA digital series. My name is Trent Johnson. I'm a Senior Vice President of Corporate Ventures over at C, and I'll be the facilitator today. So we're going to share a few slides with you at the outset just to kind of set the tone. And then I'll introduce our guests, Tom and John. We'll dig in, have a robust discussion, and then we promise to save some time at the end for some Q&A with the guests. So with that, let me share a few slides with you and we'll go from there. Rafi, if you can release the share. Perfect, thank you. Okay. Everyone see my screen okay? Perfect. Okay, so today we're going to dive into the topic of what's next. You know, what does innovating into economic recovery look like? We'll be joined by two of our guests that are from the investment community. They both have a tech and an operations mandate for the portfolio companies that they support. What's really interesting is that, you know, as here at Innovating UCLA, we spend time with a number of our corporate members. What's really interesting is when you get the lens of the investment community, you know, they're starting to think about things a bit differently. You know, much like many of the tech execs and leaders on this call, who are, you know, initially shocked and moving straight into triage. What was really interesting about the investment community is very quickly after that initial triage, they actually started moving and positioning into what's on the other side of the crisis. So that said, let's dig in a bit. So the obligatory, really large head size of me introduction slide. Just a few bits on who I am. I started my career at Citibank and KPMG in the Netherlands. My background initially focused on corporate innovation and digital transformation. So started working with the large 3 Dutch banks and eventually made it over to E-Trade in Silicon Valley. Since the dot-com era when we called things e-business instead of digital for the younger folks on the call, I've worked with innovation teams in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. And much of my career has kind of lived between two worlds. One, working on digital transformation and margin enhancement with large corporates and private equity and early stage startups. So my perspective is a bit at the crossroads of those two areas. So let's move in and just kind of set the context for our discussion. Probably doesn't bear repeating at this point the obvious that there's no lack of headlines for COVID. And this crisis, like others, shall pass. But if history is any guide, and you take a look at previous recessions, less than 15% of all the months in the last 70 years have been, 15% of all the months have been spent in recession. And recession is, again, defined as 2 quarters of negative GDP. The net economic impact of those recessions have been small by comparison. So average expansion lasted about 5 years, almost six years, with GDP growth at about 25% net, and then average recessions just under a year, and they were declining the economy about 2%. The impact of COVID is still a story being told. It's still playing out, but you know, relative to this perspective on this, these previous recessions seem encouraging by comparison to what we're seeing now. To set context for our two guests, this is a widely shared study, just to set context, but there was a study done by Harvard that did a post-recession study of about 4,700 companies across 3 previous crisis segments. And this was back in 2010. And what Harvard did in this study is they tried to understand the patterns of winners and losers and what the decisions that the executives made and how those decisions resulted in outcomes in the months, in the years after the recession. And what they basically found were there were four profiles or four cohorts that came out of it: progressive, pragmatic, promotion, and preventative. What the big highlights were is basically in the treatment of how the executives in these cohorts basically looked at headcount reduction, operational efficiency, whether they would invest in R&D or M&A, and then what they would do in terms of their SG&A spend, like marketing and things like that. And what they found was that the companies that basically belonged to the progressive segment did far better, to the tune of 2x sales in the 3 years following a recession, or 3x profit. And they outperformed their rivals. You can see that in the column there for progressive. What's interesting and what we'll talk about today is that, during a recession, it basically creates a vacuum of innovation. And some of the perspective that we get from the investment community is they see this as an opportunity in many cases to capitalize on some of those investments, acquire talent, acquire firms, and the like. So today we have the pleasure of being joined by two of our guests today from the investment community, John Calca and Thomas Fountain. John leads much of the transformation activities, both tech and ops, for Platinum Equity portfolio companies. He's got over 20 years as a CIO and senior tech exec in many firms and brands that you might recognize. He brings to the table a ton of expertise in both smart product and service strategies, as well as basically developing that next generation of leaders. He's done this for multinational billion-dollar publicly traded companies. And John is joining us today from North Carolina, where he lives with his wife and two daughters. Up the East Coast in New York, we have Tom Fountain joining us. He's an operating partner at One Rock Capital, and similar remit that he basically owns technology value creation for the One Rock Capital portfolio. Over 30 years of tech leadership experience, living in both large recognizable brands like GE and Honeywell, but also served at the helm of some startups and emerging growth companies. His expertise in product innovation, introduction and design innovation. And then one interesting factoid among many of Thomas is basically earlier in his career, an intelligence officer for the CIA. So be careful what you say on the call. Just kidding. So with that, I'm going to transition basically to the panel discussion. And let me get rid of a couple things. Okay, so so with that, folks, let's dig in. So, we are right now in the throes of COVID, and quite frankly, if we think back in history, a whopping 4 months ago when, basically all of this stuff started, everyone was a bit shell-shocked and trying to figure out what to do and where to go from there. And so the question I would ask to Thomas and John is basically this question is, as COVID became apparent and as you looked at triaging and protecting your portfolio companies, where did you start? What was a framework that you looked at in order to analyze the needs of your portfolio companies and to protect them, basically? What did that look like for you?
Go ahead, John, you can go first.
Sure. Not to be flippant, I think, frankly, started with the safety of the people. I think that's, really across all 40 of our companies. And maybe this was what was unique about, this crisis, it being a health issue, was, that really first part was looking at it from the perspective of how are we basically keeping our employees safe? And then how are those actions, right? Obviously that we were all doing, to keep them safe. How are they impacting our ability to do business? And then, it was quickly, right? Oh, wow. Now you're seeing it impact, people doing business with us, right? And that to me is, I think, really, to answer your question, right, as far as the way we first started, the framework, I'll be frank, I don't think we did it on purpose. It was the nature of this that I think we were forced into it, but I'm glad we did it that way. Um, and then, really, what our firm did was from there, then got very purposeful, really looked at it from a perspective of, okay, how are we across all of our entire portfolio quickly sharing best practices that are going to keep our employees safe, right? Make sure we have, the right compliance to, whatever was happening on the ground. Things were changing every day, on local state. And, frankly, that framework, starting with people first, quickly migrated to now, okay, what are we doing to make sure, is this business really an essential business? Does it need to, file something with local government? Right? There was this natural progression. And I would say that's how we kind of really started, sort of reacting and how it kind of came into a framework. And to you, Tom.
Yeah, we were very similar. Safety was clearly at the top of the list, just as John said. This being a public health issue, that was far and away the very first reaction is, what does this mean on a personal level? What do we need to do to make sure that people are safe and healthy and so on? The second piece was communications, right? There's a lot of uncertainty, heck, there still is. So building good communications plans to employees, to other stakeholders, to regulators, and so on. We want to make sure that we had two directional communications in place so that whatever decisions were made or whatever information we needed from the field was finding its way in. We actually set up I think 3 times a week call at like 7 at night where all the CEOs and CFOs and kind of COOs were all on the call together, and we would go through each business fairly quickly. But what are you seeing? What are they seeing? What practices have you come up with? How are you dealing with taking temperature as people come back to work if it's essential, and so on. So communications was a big thing. And then, and really, just like John said, then it became, how do we assess the disruptions, both internally and externally, that are going to, impinge on the way that we do business. So trying to quantify, trying to understand, the drivers, understand the leverage points, to try to mitigate some of those disruptions. Of course, cash flow and cash preservation was a really big deal. If all of a sudden, customers and suppliers are paying or not paying or expecting us to, to pay sooner. And we had a bunch of folks, wanting us to be their bank and so on. And we said, no, we don't think so. We're in the same boat you are. So that was a big deal. And the last one, that was also there was, I'll call it regulatory readiness, which was, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow from a regulation or, government point of view. How do we make sure that we can consume with, with legal, with ops and everyone else? How do we look at, the new state guidelines for reopening and apply those to our business and make sure that, we were on the proper side of the interpretation so that we didn't do something that was out of bounds. Yeah. But, as we said, this was constantly changing, and it required a great deal of flexibility and agility, frankly, to respond on an ongoing basis.
So Tom, I definitely get that a bit of a changing a tire on a moving car because you're figuring it out as you go. But in many cases, many of the tech executives on the phone spent a number of hours, a lot of money on things like business continuity planning. How helpful was something like your business continuity plans to prepare your portfolio companies for the COVID crisis?
Yeah, anyone who does business continuity planning and DR and so on thinks like this at least some portion of their time. They think about unexpected events. They think about, capabilities that can be disrupted and so forth. In many cases, the folks who had been charged with doing, DR and BCP kinds of work, maybe even from an IT point of view, really had an opportunity to step forward and bring that skill set to the broader business table, right? And help them think about how to categorize, how to prioritize, how to plan, how to respond. In many cases, some of the other functions weren't as prepared as IT was, but it was a useful set of skills, certainly. And I think a lot of lessons were learned that, those are practices that can be applied, much more broadly than, conventionally people think about it, sometimes limited to more of an IT backdrop.
Got it. John, what about you? How helpful was BCP for your portcos?
I think it was, look, to Tom's point, I'd answer your question by saying companies that were prepared got a return on that investment because they were prepared. At the same time, I would say looking across 40 different companies, it was really eye-opening because if you think about traditionally business continuity planning, it's really an evolution of disaster recovery, right? I mean, companies were doing, oh my gosh, what happens, if my data center explodes, right? And then companies then took that to the next level and say, okay, well, that solves one problem. I needed to do business continuity planning because it's not just about replicating a data center. I think what I personally learned in a lot of companies is that natural evolution is good, but it left a lot of gaps. It really did. There was a lot of things that, because this was a health crisis, right? It started with people worrying about, this slow but very quick drip, right? It was different. I would just share like one silly story, but I'm sure we all have similar. It's like, I don't think any of us really thought about, for the first 3-4 weeks, all of the major teleconference companies like your host, we all went to dial-in and bridge calls and Zoom, but there was capacity constraints on those, right? And all of a sudden, we were starting to step on ourselves because, everybody's conference calls stopped working, or you had to start dialing in 5-10 minutes early or 5-10 minutes late because, AT&T couldn't keep up, right? So it was those little things that, frankly, I think I walked away from saying there's real gaps. Building your business continuity plan off of an old disaster recovery plan, which is what a lot of our companies did, missed a lot of the nuances of, this type of crisis. But in the end, we leveraged stuff. I mean, I don't want to discourage saying we shouldn't have done it and we didn't have good, but there's gaps and things we took away from it.
No, absolutely.
So one other thing I would just add real quick is that people started to realize the actual difference between disaster recovery and continuity planning, right? A lot of people think of recovery as, okay, it takes some amount of time, right? Call it your recovery point, right? Or recovery time. But continuity is instant, right? I don't want to lose my ability to conduct business. I'm not waiting around for this recovery stuff, right? I want to be able to transition almost seamlessly to continuity of what I'm trying to do. And a lot of people were, just not prepared because they hadn't really thought about the differences between those two dimensions and what it really takes to be, continuous in your performance.
Yeah. So I guess the question I would ask then is, given your experience with, DRBCP plans being what they are and kind of what you saw as a result of kind of deploying your frameworks, what are some of the key learnings you took away? So if you got a chance to go back 4 months, what would you do differently this go around as a result of the learnings that you've gotten over the last 4 months?
I think for me, and for our companies, this concept of return to operations, right? It's a really important part of any business continuity disaster recovery, right? But in the current environment, it's return to a different type of operations. And, how do we adjust our business continuity to take that into account, right? That this isn't about, getting back to, the way you ran your business before the crisis. This is a situation where you got to get your company to a new operating model as quickly as possible. So it's like sort of RTO, it's RTNO, right? Return to new operations. And that's probably my biggest takeaway and how we think about it.
Yeah. Tom, what about you?
I think for us, it was, sort of doubling down on the importance of people, the people aspect of, continuity and recovery and so forth, because all of a sudden, because of this being a public health issue and so on, people couldn't get together. Some people might have fallen ill, so they couldn't do their recovery work, even if it was remote and so forth. So really, sort of once you build your plan and sort of simulate it through and test it and so on, be extra sure, right, that you simulate the scenarios like this where people aren't available to do all the work that you have in your plan. And what alternatives do you have? Maybe another part of the country, some other part of the portfolio could step in and help, because they have people that can do some things. It really drove home, the criticality of the people resource to be able to execute all those plans.
Makes sense. So where are you guys in the cycle now? Or are your much of your portfolio companies still in triage mode? Are you emerging from triage? Where are you in the cycle?
I think for us, I think every business is, kind of well through the triage, right? I mean, we've had enough months of cycles of learning to say, okay, we've got a pretty good understanding of what's been disrupted, what flexibility we have to operate, what people are available, can they come to the office if it's essential, and so on. So I'd say we're through triage, and I'd say about half are in the, sort of formulation, sort of pre-emerging kind of zone where, their markets are still very slow, but they've, put themselves in a position to be ready. I'd say the other half, because their markets have recovered more quickly, and they've made the adjustments, maybe it's going direct or other things we'll talk about, I'm sure, they're further down in their, sort of early recovery phase. Now, to John's point, is it going to be recovery to the same spot? Almost never, right, at this point. The business models and things are definitely impacted. I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit, but I'd say maybe those half are realizing, it's not a straight line back to where we were, right? There's going to be some bumps and curves that we didn't expect, and we're going to have to be pretty dynamic to finish that recovery job.
Yeah. John, what about you in terms of where your portcos are in the cycle? Still in triage?
Very similar, Tom. No, I think, I would say we got through triage very quickly. In fact, I'd probably say some people might even find the word triage to be not really totally accurate, right? It was reacting, crisis management, right? But we weren't making choices, right, of who dies, who lives, say from a triage perspective, thankfully, as far as which businesses we were not gonna, it was just crisis management, reacting, getting out of that. And to Tom's points, now trying to figure out, are we ready to, capitalize on some of the new stuff, right? I mean, there's opportunities that come out of everything. I thought, one of the things that I'll just say that was kind of interesting was a number of our companies, in a very respectful way, I want to be careful how I say this, all the tools that they had put in place to drive self-service with their suppliers or their customers, right? You always struggle getting adoption and those types of things. But because of the situation and this shared experience that everybody was going through, a lot of our companies were actually phenomenally successful very quickly in basically creating a shared dialogue with their customers and suppliers. Say, look, you call into our call center. Normally, we'd love to be able to staff that and have people available to take all your questions.
Right.
But we're all living through this. Can you use more of the self-service stuff that we've been investing in for years? And it was very interesting, how that started stuff, frankly, become organic. And now we're, frankly, reaping rewards from it. Customers are happier. We're more efficient on it, right? But we got this change through there.
So
we got through that.
Yeah. So just a bit of digging in there for a second, John. So was that deliberate at the outset, leveraging more technology during this time to preserve your customer relationships as part of a deliberate strategy, or that was just what you happened upon with many of your portcos because that was what was called for?
It's funny. I want to reference back to something that Tom said, and because I think there's a difference between being prepared and doing stuff deliberately, right? I mean, but to Tom's point, I mean, people weren't able to come to call centers, right? I mean, you could have all the business continuity, you could have all the remote, but that wasn't deliberate by any means, Trent, right? So having those hard conversations with your customers that say, we didn't deliberately all of a sudden cut 20% of the people that normally are there to pick up the phones. Yeah. We didn't do that. That's what happened to us. Now, how do we leverage the technology that we might have had in place for the last 2, 3 years?
Got it.
But it was different work. Customers chose not to use it, right? It's always been kind of optional. And now, we were kind of working together to make those.
Makes sense.
So I think I just want to be very careful because, the word deliberate,
Yeah.
it wasn't. I think that's the point where, a lot of this, you got to be, I like how Tom, flexible, nimble, and, work with what you got.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Tom, let's I guess pivot this idea of lessons learned, because COVID is a very real time set of lessons that you have to learn and deploy. But if we look at just previous economic downturns, so for example that Harvard study where they looked at the dot-com crisis, the Great Recession, there's some things that we've gone through before, arguably not the same as what we saw with what we're seeing with COVID. But are there any lessons from previous economic cycles that, as you all went about this, some of it we knew or that we could apply to COVID? Any lessons from the past that you were allowed to bring forward these days for the COVID crisis?
Yeah, I think in general, every time you go through one of these, you expand your learning set, right? And you start to see the dynamics of how an industry responds, how customers respond, and so forth. So I think just the framework of having been through some cycles, right? And a lot of our businesses have pretty senior folks who've been around for multiple cycles. They've been able to take those kind of structural mindsets of how did the industry I work in change, how did it respond, what was the characteristics of the crisis or the recession or whatever the driver was, and how did people respond, and more importantly, then what opportunities did it create? So I think going into the sort of the early elements or the timeframes of the COVID scenario, a lot of the business leaders were able to sort of pull up those lessons learned, those sort of framework or structures, and say, are there the same types of patterns, right? Are the competitors in my market responding in a similar way or not, right? To try to anticipate moves so that we could outmaneuver, right, and so forth. And so I think this one being kind of different than a classic economic recession or other things, we've expanded that learning even further. And I think it's providing a lot of additional lessons around the other dimensions that need to be brought into that framework for successive, future events.
Awesome. John, what about you? Any lessons learned or carried forward from previous economic downturns?
Yeah, I'd say two, just to add on with Tom's. I think the first, and it was just done a lot faster, but every company quickly was reminded of the need to refocus, right? The challenge with this crisis was, you went from boom, 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 right, to, almost hitting a wall. And, having the ability, and this is just a basic business competency, and to Tom's point, good leadership teams do this, having the ability to say, okay, what is really important for us right now? What is those investments that we've been, that were going to be the game changers? And which ones were the ones that, hey, we were in the middle of a fantastic economy and we were trying a couple things that, maybe now aren't the priority, right? Using, lessons and frameworks from other economic downturns to quickly get that focus back was essential. I'd say the other thing too, and this is another, just a specific detail that I found very interesting was, in the last economic downturn, a number of our companies really learned the value of paying attention to government regulation and driving plans based on, even though it's not guaranteed what might happen. And I'll give a specific example. A number of our companies, have distribution centers, warehouses, they have part-time labor, right? The companies that I would say got it right looked and said, okay, there's going to be this government stimulus. People are going to get this extended aid. How do we make sure that we're compensating and motivating properly so that we don't have this labor shortage 12 weeks from now, right? Because, people are going, some of that your labor is getting, a different type of stimulus, right? And they may choose not to. I saw a real, there were some companies who took that lesson from other and tried to proactively plan their actions related to what the government might do to stimulate the economy and those types of things. And it was a great lesson learned. It was actually, as opposed to, unfortunately, some that didn't. And now they're in the middle of a labor shortage, right? So I think that's a great lesson, pay attention to what you think the government's going to do at a local and federal level, to stimulate out of an economic crisis and proactively, plan for it.
That regulation is a really good point. The regulatory environment. One thing I'd like to key in on, Tom, a second ago in your response, you talked about the importance of what you see in the competitive landscape. And I guess, what's interesting, because, a number of us, we work for single companies and potentially we know what's happening with that competitive landscape. But, as you look across, a portfolio of X number of companies, what did you see happening in the competitive landscape more broadly, I suspect? And how did those things change for your portfolio companies? Anything that you can comment on there?
Yeah, what was very interesting is as we evaluated what was going on in each of the different industries that we play in, we could see some fairly sharp differentiation between competitors who had been more thoughtful, more deliberate about investing in things like agility, speed, analytics, and such, right? Because I think part of this lessons learned aspect is, hey, how did it go last time? What do we wish we had capabilities to better respond? Some folks realize that the way you maneuver through, a downturn, whether it's economic or health or such is, how quickly you can reconfigure your business, how quickly you can reconfigure your supply chain, the speed with which, you can make decisions, especially in say COVID, where things are happening every day. And then the whole analytics thing, right? Now, most people are broadly investing in analytics, right? But if you're purposefully, making progress on the type of analytics that will help you with the precision of the work that you're doing, the precision of the areas that you're going to purposely change, then do it fast and do it flexibly, right? The other two pieces. Those were the competitors where we could see they were doing those things and we were trying to maybe as well. They were clearly winning, right? Because they were able to much more deftly reconfigure themselves and just outmaneuver, right? Because in a lot of cases, if there's only one supplier still supplying to an industry, the person who gets there first is going to be okay, and the others are going to be on the outside looking in, right? So if you could see that coming and maneuver yourself to reconfigure the supply chain to get that supplier locked up, you were in much, much, much better shape than the other competitors who were just too slow to get there in time. So, it's kind of two things maybe woven into one, but the agility, the speed, and so forth has become a real weapon, right? Versus the traditional investments of new product innovation, cost reduction, and so on. Now it's these, sort of more characteristics of how we operate that are playing a big role in success.
Yeah, it definitely sounds, and you've kind of hit on this theme earlier as well, that this idea of flexibility and agility, that potentially is going to be a byproduct of having gone through COVID. John, as you look at the competitive landscape, again, across the portcos that Platinum has, what do you see as some of the noted insights or changes that you're seeing in that landscape?
I think for, making sure, that companies today are opening their eyes to a wider scope of who their competitors might be. That's what we're really trying to make sure is happening, because, this, I think the word unprecedented, right, is maybe overused, but it's not underused either, right? And when you have this sort of disruption in your market and your landscapes, I get nervous if somebody says, let me dust off that PowerPoint from last year that tells you my competitive landscape and what my competitors might be doing. Yeah. Because the real reality is, yes, look at those. Absolutely. They were your competitors yesterday, they're competitors today. But what are you doing? Because now there might be a whole new competitor you never thought about. The environment is absolutely ripe for disruption. Companies, and I know we'll talk through this, the whole concept of the touchless economy and things that are happening. I think we'll all look back at this point in our lives and say, people's behavior changed faster, right? And we'll have a longer term in the last 3-4 months than anybody could have predicted. And that absolutely creates an environment for people to come out of the blue, somebody you never would have thought was a competitor, and totally disrupt your model because now they're appealing to a behavior in your customer or your supplier base that wouldn't have been rational 6 months ago. So I think that's kind of the trend we're trying to pay attention to and watch out for.
Yeah, we led this discussion with a few slides, and the one that I find particularly interesting is it's just the duration of recessions or recessionary cycles. From an overall portfolio planning perspective in terms of a time horizon, do you all have a view of what that time horizon is that you're thinking COVID will last, that you're having to support your portfolio companies through for planning purposes? What does that time horizon look like for you all that you've been discussing with your executives on your portcos?
I would say we're right in the thick of figuring out what horizon we're going to apply, right? Having now come through Triage, gotten into this stage where, the restructure, reemergence and so on, doing business differently, et cetera, that's been absorbed. Now people are starting to apply because we're, sort of in strategic planning period, right? July, August is, fairly often, that sort of time of year when people stop and look big picture and so on. I think for the shorter cycle businesses, they're seeing a recovery that, matches somewhat the rate of decline. And so they're trying to say, okay, with a little bit of margin to it, safety margin, where do we see, business returning back to more normal levels? Yeah. The way we do it might be different, but at least, back to maybe more normal demand levels. And then adding, a bit of a factor on top of that to say, what if, right? There's a third wave, or what if there's more stimulus, or what if, some other externality is going to change the dynamics and so forth, and trying to find an appropriate planning horizon to develop, a credible business plan against. It's not easy right now. There's still a lot of questions up and down the value chain and so forth of how customers are going to act, how suppliers are going to act, how the government's going to act. It's definitely a work in progress.
Yeah. It's interesting. And John, same question to you, but, if you play analyst and kind of listening to the Morningstar reports and that type of stuff, consensus is somewhere back half of 2021, possibly all the way through to 2023. Would you disagree with that? Would you say that it's a big enough window we can kind of, that's in line with kind of some of our planning assumptions, or, still too early to tell? John, any guidance there?
I would never use the word guidance with what I'm saying on this one.
Sorry.
Okay. But what I would say is I think the logic you're using, Trent, I've heard a lot of people use it, and I'll be very direct. It's tied to the concept of when will a vaccine come out? How effective would the vaccine be? How quickly will it be used across, globally? When you say timeframes like that, it's hard for me not to make those connections. And I would say, just like I think almost all businesses are doing that same sort of math and thinking through that, and that's the thing. I would say, one of our leaders, he said something in a meeting a couple of days ago that was very impactful to me in relation to the same sort of question, Trent, was let's not take too much time trying to predict, when, because the point is right now, there's still ripples in the water, right? Like there's just too many ripples. It's not settled, right? And, ripples aren't always bad. I mean, there's some really upside potential on it. And we're seeing things in our recovery in our companies, right, that are, surprising, but it makes sense when you start stepping back, right, understanding what's happening. Well, I mean, the amount, some of our companies, had a, high focus of let's talk about do-it-yourself sort of product, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, yeah, it shouldn't really surprise us, but that ripple has been amazing. I mean, the demand generated into these businesses right now of people around the world spending more time at home and making, their lives and their homes better, is, I don't know if that ripple will ever stop, right? I mean, or if it does, if it's so far out, that's a hard thing to predict.
Yeah.
So we're taking more of a, I would just say our approach is use the same general, rules of thumb you're just talking through, but at the same time, don't take your eyes off the fact that there's things right now you can be looking at and capitalizing on, and
Right.
For really making your company better.
Okay. No, definitely. Well, let's shift gears a bit. So we talked about triage. We talked about lessons that we've learned from previous downturns and things like that. But as I said at the outset, what's really interesting about the investor perspective is this turning of perspective, where you are starting to look forward and now having come out of that initial reaction to to shoring up the house for COVID. So if you start to think about investments, in particular in technology, what type of investments do you see being made during the crisis?
Yeah, so it's all starting with what are the core problems that you're trying to solve, as it should, right? Any tech investment should always be grounded in, solving a business problem or creating success in an opportunity. So, we're having conversations with our businesses. What's holding you back? What's stopping you from scaling? What's helping you from, holding you back from being agile and so on. We get a lot of questions or comments about, the war for talent. It's still hard to, obviously going into COVID, the market was tight for labor, especially experienced labor in some of the areas. So there's a lot of interest in automation, right? Get as much as we can from being able to automate various backroom tasks or even mid-office tasks, so that we don't have such a reliance on people. And I'd say the other big one is around just the dynamics of managing a supply chain. What can we do differently to shorten, to make it more dynamic, to have partnerships that are more flexible. So there's a lot of work going into how do we share information with our chosen few strategic partners so that they are in a position to serve us the next time we get into one of these, right? And it's not just, can you make product, right? It's a lot of information sharing, it's a lot of planning and a bunch of other things. So we want to look for ways to, years ago, it was about bonding digitally with customers. Now the whole bonding with suppliers has taken on a whole new meaning to make sure that you have that continuity of supply and the dynamics throughout the supply chain that support the changes you might make in your overall business model.
So Tom, you talked a second ago about automation was an example that you pointed to. As you think about that as a strategic, large digital transformation purchase, if you will, is that driven by a need of the business, or because people were less busy, or potentially this was an opportunity basically to kind of shore up the balance sheet, that type of thing? Like what goes into that decision to invest in something like automation?
Yeah, there's always a couple of factors, right, that matter. One is the availability of talent to be able to do work. Can you get support, or can you hire people when you need them to grow the business? Can you shortcut that by automating key processes that are repeatable, right? You bring that to it. I think the other big one is the speed aspect, right, and the precision aspect, right? Humans operate at like 3 Sigma, if you're a 6 Sigma fan, and machines are measurably better than that. In critical areas where you need repeatable, high speed, high quality execution, you need to look carefully and say, is there an automation play, at least for those key parts of that process, that will really ultimately benefit from having, an automation story built in? So back to the agility piece, the speed piece, and so on. And, in the automation, the big conversation we've had with folks is this isn't just automate some static process. Take the opportunity to infuse that automated process with intelligence, right? At every step where you're making a decision in that process flow, let's make sure we tap into the analytics capability that we're also trying to build out so that you're making very smart decisions at each step of that automated flow, right? Because there's probably multiple paths that a particular, order or, whatever else might take through the process. But let's make sure that we're being as smart as we can at every one of those stages. So really make those processes, those automated processes, much more intelligent rather than just static.
Yeah. And I throw something on top of that to Tom's comments about automation. I think, and it'll tie out to what we started this conversation with. What's interesting to me is our automation investments now have a new input, and it is tied to business continuity, right? It's fascinating. 6 months ago, we would have balanced an investment in automation against other options to do it, whether it was with people in different countries, people, more efficiently, through process improvement, right? These were the things that an automation investment would have been, your ROI against your other options. Now, when we're looking at automation investments, there's this new thing that says, okay, how does that tie to you? And that comes back to a new definition of business continuity, right? Will this allow you to service customers, more without worrying about a human impact of people being sick? So it's kind of it's a neat time. The other thing I would say, and I hope I don't ruin the magic for everybody on a Zoom call here, but we met before this call and just kind of all met each other and got to know it. And Tom said something a few weeks ago that was incredibly prescient. It's really come through more and more. Is one of the key technology investments, more and more we're doing as well, is taking your analytics to a level of granularity that we have not had before. Looking at trying to really understand customer behavior, market behaviors, right? To the granularity, more real time, because not just from the how do we use this as an opportunity, but also, frankly, to make sure we don't do anything stupid. There's just a lot of, sort of knee-jerk type things you could do in a situation like this, right? And, investing and getting that next level. And Tom, I brought this up, I'm seeing it. It's kind of funny. Almost the majority of our companies are naturally pulling in, saying we have to have this. And I think that's a really key, just universal technology investment that's happening. And it's more than just generic and analytics. And I put it back to you, Tom, because I think you were more eloquent when we first met about this, explaining, the dynamics. But I would say it's been very, very interesting to see that play out.
Yeah, the simple comment is, agility and speed and precision is a very strong differentiating combination, right? If you know where the problem is, what the best answer is, and you can decide it and act on it really quickly, you're hard to beat, right? There's a very famous paper, the OODA loop, you might have heard, the fighter pilot in Vietnam wrote a very seminal paper about winning a dogfight, right? It was how quickly he could observe the environment, orient himself, decide what to do, and do it faster than his competitor, so to speak, and he'd win the dogfight. And I think businesses as a whole have, need to have a very similar mentality that said, if I can out execute in that type of cycle, I'm going to win the big game, right? But you don't, that won't happen by accident. You have to build very purposefully the capabilities for all of those pieces. Can I sense the environment? Can I determine the best course of action? Rally everybody to taking that and do it, right? All faster, right? End to end, faster than anybody I'm competing with. And if so, I think you win in the long term, right? There may be bumps along the way, but if you can consistently execute that cycle faster than anyone else, I think you're, a very formidable competitor.
Yeah. Hey, so Tom, in building that archetype of a more flexible, more data analytics driven company, we talked a bit about automation and the like. Um, in terms of this environment, are you making strategic hires right now in your portcos to basically shore those types of investment up? Are those some of the strategic hires you're making? What are some others?
Yeah, so I would say we're not yet hiring for growth per se. We are hiring replacements, right? We certainly don't want to be short of resource. The key thing is, what are the characteristics of the people we're trying to hire, right? So that when we do hire someone, whether it's a replacement or someone, a new position or just new scale, what type of mental approach, right? What kind of thought processes do they go through? Can they be a real asset for us as we're thinking through the things we were just talking about, right? About how to out execute, right? About the speed of decision making, about the precision that's required, right? So that you can confidently make those fast decisions. People who have experience in those areas, people who just have a passion for, thinking end to end, right? In that loop, if you will. That's, a very important set of characteristics that we're more and more looking for in the people that we're hiring.
And John, what about you in terms of strategic hires in this part of the cycle? What do you see across your portfolio companies?
I think it's a mix. We are making some investments for growth. We've got a diverse enough portfolio that, again, some of our companies are just doing fantastic. So you try to bring in. What I do find interesting, it goes back to Tom's point about the attributes or characteristics. It's some things are getting accelerated, and I'll just use kind of another example, but 3 months ago when we were hiring for any sort of senior leader, right, I would say we weren't very patient if that senior leader tried to present themselves as, hey, I've been doing this for 20 years, I know this industry, I get it, tech, innovation, flexibility, they're important, but it's really about, the 20 years I'm bringing to the table, knowing whatever industry it is, right? I would have said, 3-4 months ago, we were not very patient with that, and that person, probably wouldn't have been hired, but sometimes they would have been, right? Where today, it's really not happening. The characteristics are just totally different to Tom's kind of comment there. It's like, somebody who presents themselves that way, that doesn't, specifically, and I mean, even to a CEO level, right? A CEO that is interviewing and doesn't say something along the lines where, hey, I love analytics. I dig in deep. I create my own analytics, right? Those kinds of behaviors mean a lot to us, right? Because it means the person's going to do it. Where 6 months ago, that I don't want to say it wasn't the same level. Does that help? I hope that.
No, absolutely. So,
yeah, please. We're even asking questions, tell us about a time when you created speed, right? Tell us about a time when you drove rapid reconfiguration of an operating model, right? Questions that maybe we didn't traditionally think of before, because to John's point, experience, right? Long-term experience was highly valued. Oh, you must know this industry so well. You know all the people, the suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. Well, guess what? At the rate of change that things are going now, that could be a liability to a degree, right? And so, we need to complement it with these other questions to say, fine, you may know a lot of things as of yesterday, but how are you equipped to deal with the change that's coming tomorrow?
Right. No, that definitely makes a ton of sense. So I know we talked a bit about what you would, flexible organizations and things like that. But I guess the question I would ask is, as you are helping your portfolio companies to position, what does success look like to you in terms of helping your companies to be ready for an emergence from COVID? What would the big things have been that you would have accomplished for your companies so that you could say like, yep, check that box, that milestone, that KPI? What does that success scorecard look like for your portcos as they get ready to emerge from COVID? John or Tom, feel free.
Go ahead, John.
Um, you know, I think there's this thing, the concept of resiliency, right? And if we can walk out of this and our companies have demonstrated, even better their ability to weather, change their models, react, right? You know, it'll become a new measurement of what the value of a company is, right? So, I would, and I like to give examples, so, pardon me, but, for a company that might have had a goal to have 50 million, selling, in direct to consumer channel, right? You know, they may not hit that target this year, but now less than just them hitting that, it's how effective were they in their, return on investment in advertising? Were they able to react quick enough in this new world, right? That showed, okay, they didn't hit the revenue goal, but wait a minute, hold on. If you look at the effectivity of their ad dollars, this was a company that was on top of it. And they didn't waste a whole bunch of spend. They didn't, so it's that resilience, reaction. If we can really kind of show that, I think we'd be very proud.
Yeah. Tom, what about you? The readiness to emerge from COVID, what does that look like?
Yeah, I very much agree with what John was just saying. We coined a term the other day, 3 + 2 + 5. And what we meant by that was, over the next 3 years, what are the set of things we're looking to achieve? Then the following 2, and by the way, that 5 years, let's say, is the average holding period, right, for a private equity, investment and so forth. But the +5 part is so critical, right? Where is that company positioned for the next 5 years, meaning for the next owner, right? Or if they went public. And so a conscious, hey, we've got to deliver great performance, right? Year over year, show growth in revenue, EBITDA, whatever the case may be. But at the same time, have a real emphasis on capability building, right? Demonstrate your ability to succeed in diverse operating environments like high growth, low growth, pandemic, whatever the case may be, so that, at year 5, when it's time to sell that investment or take it public and so on, you've got a looking back, great track record of delivering financial results, but you have just as powerful of a forward-looking view that says, look at the capabilities that we've built, right? Function by function, business by business, and so forth. And look how well positioned we are to deal with whatever's coming next. And it really helps open up, as we're doing strategic planning right now, for people to think beyond, right? Just, engineering good financial performance, really thinking about the investments and the changes that need to be made and the underlying enabling functions, if you will. So that, I like to say you can't build a 20-story building with scaffolding that only goes up 10 floors, right? You really need to be thinking like that, as if you're the one that's going to be buying this company in 5 years. What would you like to be handed, right? And so, it's really putting a premium on thinking on both tracks to make sure that you've got a great story looking back and looking forward.
Absolutely. So I'll tell you what, we want to save some time on the back end of the call, basically, for questions from the audience. I just have maybe 1 or 2 more questions for you, but if I can get both of you to put on your Swami hat and grab a crystal ball, knowing that we are in the throes of COVID, not going to hold you to any big predictions or anything like that, but I guess the question I would say is, if I look back at like the Great Recession and some of the companies that were born out of the Great Recession, as an example, Groupon, Cabbage, a lot of these companies that were gig economy companies that were born out of the need, basically to help citizens find new ways of making ends meet. I guess the question that I would ask is like, what are some of the, and feel free to answer this, wax poetic if you like, but what are some of the big themes and shifts in customer behavior, in business models, be that B2B, B2C, but what are some of those big things that you think once this is all over, these will be like the gig economy was to the Great Recession, these will be one of those bits that hang around and that are more permanent as we move forward. John, let's start with you.
Ooh.
Yeah, I know.
I'll go first because I've got one if you want to.
Go ahead, Tom. They'll give me a chance to.
just because it was top of mind last week.
Yeah.
One of the big ticket items that a couple of our businesses are very focused on is sustainability, and there's a lot of different definitions of that. Corporate responsibility, sustainability, and so on. And the UN and other NGOs and so on, they break it down into something like 17 different subsegments, right? Climate change, sustainable communities, this, and this, right? Healthy populations, and there's a whole range in there. I think that is a very compelling, very rich sort of macro trend, right? Citizens want to be responsible members of the population, right? They worry about climate change. They worry about health of populations. They worry about, consumption of natural resources and so on. So, we're looking really hard at really every aspect of the business to say our products, the way we work with the community, the way we work with governments and so on, to have a unifying theme of sustainability to motivate our associates and our suppliers and customers and our community members and so on as a real way to unify a lot of folks in a direction that frankly has a great payback financially, as a provider of solutions in that space, but frankly is something that, pretty much everybody can kind of get on board with some aspect of this and say, hey, it's good for me, it's good for my neighbor, it's good for the community, it's good for the world. Yeah. So we just see a lot of richness in that kind of umbrella term, if you will, that we think has a lot of room to grow.
Yeah, and John, I know earlier on you kind of talked about like the contactless society, the shift from work from home, but crystal ball, what are the big bits that you see coming out of this that'll be around for us that we'll have to incorporate as a part of our life going forward for business models and whatnot?
Yeah, I think how we calculate the value of convenience and what the price point is for convenience is going to dramatically change. Everything from everything from what people might have been willing to pay 6 months ago to see a new release movie at home, right? Compared to what they'd be willing to pay 3 months from now in the United States. It's a great example, right? But, I would say businesses need to be rethinking that, because it's one that you can apply to so many places in your own business where there's opportunities, because, the pricing, the whole equation is different, right? And understanding how you reap that is pretty key. But I bring it back to it. It's really, if it has me to wax poetically, it's about convenience. People will now, I think people are quick to talk about the obvious examples, right? Whether it's, home delivery of groceries, right? All that. But take it one more level and think to yourself, 6 months ago, I might have been comfortable paying $100 a year to have, a delivery service, right? Now I'm maybe comfortable to spend $1,000 a year. Well, what does that mean? That means I need my fruit to be fresh. I need this, it's a whole different game that I think, if we put on our hat and think ahead, tie it to convenience. What's the price point for it? And that's a lot richer conversation than just saying the contactless society.
No, absolutely. Well, look, I will tell you, I've been watching the chat bar fill up, and I know there are a number of our guests that are chomping at the bit to ask you all some questions. So Rafi, if I can turn it over to you to unmute some of our folks, and we'll take some of those questions. Folks, if you want to, I guess for lack of a better term, raise your hand in the chat bar. I know Jim Rinaldi, you had a question that you wanted to ask.
Thank you, Trent and the panelists. This is a great discussion. My thinking is the global impact of this pandemic. It's not like a recession in the United States. It's not like a war in the Middle East. This is far-reaching, and if you're a company that has supply chain or has offices. I used to work for Marriott, so you can imagine And you probably know the impact to travel has been, pretty bad. But how would you look at that from a portfolio if a good part of your revenue comes in from Great Britain or from Europe, and things get bad, or Brazil, for example. So how do you look at that, and how do you take a global view while also having to satisfy a local presence?
James, I'll jump in. I think that's a great question. And I think, for us, it starts with look at your supply chain, look at your employees, look at your customers, right? Don't try to answer it for your whole business, right? You're right. It's a global pandemic, but the impact is just so, it's different and it's constantly changing. So when we're looking at things, and you say, how are we responding? We would have a very different discussion when we say, how are we responding supply chain wise? Because that has an impact, right? How are we supplying? How are we responding customer wise? It goes again back to some of the great insights Tom's already shared. Well, you better really understand your customer data and what's going on at that granular level to where your customers are. I mean, we're getting to the point, where, we used to think about selling to Home Depot, as a customer, and they place demand on us, right? But now companies need to start thinking about, okay, well, that's Home Depot in California. And California is now starting to close things up again. And in California, will Home Depot still be considered essential, right? So it goes back to, some of those, and that really, you gotta be able to get to that granular level. We're talking customers. And I just end that. I think I always try to remind myself, and you also got to take it back to your employees. Where are your physically employees? Because the safety of your employees is a responsibility that you have to take and make a priority. And don't mix that up with your concern about customers and supply chain. What's happening there? Is your employee base in a hot spot right now? How are you reacting? So that, and Tom going additional, that helps.
It is a great question, and what comes to mind is what degree of reshaping can you do, whether it's in how you make, how you ship, how you serve customers, and so forth, right? So there's kind of the how, there's the where, there's the when, and so forth, right? And a company who's in a position where they have the pulse of what's going on in these different locations and different regulations and so on, and are able to cycle through all of those different, sort of permutations and come up with, hey, for the next month or 2 or 3, based on best available knowledge, what's the most effective way to run the business to preserve as much revenue as we can while we're going through these big swings and disruptions, right? Can I retarget, reposition, resequence work where things are made, how things are sold, and so on across the different geographies to try to, sort of stay a step ahead or come in right behind, a country or a state being a hotspot where it closed back down, right?
It just seems to me that the companies that are more digitally enabled or can move more rapidly digitally can overcome those things faster than those that may still be in the legacy way of doing
no
things.
No doubt, right? It's back to the analytics comment, right, that we were talking about before, the precision with which you can detect. I mean, look, to win the game, right, in the best case scenario is your analytics are giving you lead time, right? They're detecting anomalies, they're detecting disruption, and it's giving you at least some amount of time to orchestrate the response, right, that still makes it a timely and winning capability, right? And it's back to out executing your competition, right? You figure all that stuff out with, and you have more lead time, better odds that you're going to get there first and get that sale. And so I always look at analytics and automation and so on as really tightening the cycle time of that loop I talked about, so that you can respond very, very quickly from initial detection right through the execution of an optimized response, right? I mean, that's lofty, but it's an ambition that I think is a valuable one.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim, for that question. I think we have another question from Maxim Gill. Maxim, you want to ask your question?
Yes, hello. My question is around innovation. Do you think the work from home culture that seems to be prevailing to almost permanent time will affect innovation in your companies?
I would say absolutely. I mean, there's nothing like getting a bunch of people around a whiteboard and having a high speed, sort of exchange of ideas, right? Now, some digital technologies can help that for sure. And, we'll have to grow into doing it more remotely. So I expect there, to still be a meaningful dip. I don't know if we get all the way back. I mean, look, the ideal scenario is you have multiple ways to do innovative things, right? Some digital, some physically together, all of that. Anytime you take one of those away, right, you're sort of, your optimal isn't going to be quite as good as it is when you had more choices. But, I think that, there's an opportunity just, like Trent was saying, where born out of necessity, Cabbage and this and that and the other came along and, solved a new problem. Well, remote collaboration and remote innovation or distributed innovation, the concepts have been there a long time, but I think we have a long way to go to really fully, come close to what it is when everybody's in the same room. It's just going to take, some time and a lot of really creative work to sort of overcome the physical separation in this domain.
Yeah. And I think, Maxim, I think what I'd add to your question, though, if you don't mind, is this new remote work, how does it impact companies' ability to get discretionary effort out of their employees? Because I frankly think that's the bigger issue, right? Innovation comes, right, through collaboration, but also employees and people feeling passionate about their companies,
Yes.
wanting their companies to be better. That drives innovation, but it starts with the willingness to put in that extra effort, right? And, it is challenging in a remote environment, but in some ways, I see a lot of positive. It's forcing, I'm seeing a lot of leadership have to adjust their styles where showing a little more caring, frankly, gets a little more discretionary, which gets a little more innovation, right? The leaders that are recognizing and being direct with people on their teams or their companies and saying, hey, I understand, your local school district just totally put in rules in place now where, you've got a daycare issue, right? I know it sounds strange, but I see a direct connection to the leaders who get that and don't penalize, right? Where those teams will actually be more innovative in the long run. They'll be more where, frankly, companies who ignore it and try not to react and think, okay, why aren't you? It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Why aren't you available to me right now? Just like you normally would have been. If you overreact in a bad way there, I think you'll actually see some innovation. So in some ways, I think this is very positive.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I wonder if anytime more than 6 months ago, a chief strategist ever turned to a head of HR and asked the question, hey, what would we do if nobody could come to the office for 6 months, right? What would the head of HR have responded, right? Nobody's thinking like that. Nobody's imagining that. I'm sure some people have, but generally it's not topic of conversation, right? But in a way, right, that fundamental of a question calls, forward a lot of just completely open your mind kind of consequences and necessary responses, right? And now we want to, oh, by the way, now HR leaders are being asked that question. And by the way, we want it all fixed within the next 3 weeks, right? So, it's a fascinating dynamic here of, I think HR has one of the hardest challenges of any functional area, in this period. Obviously, the safety and public health and all that is a key part of it, but just the way we work has been so changed and so disrupted, right? Technology can only help so much. I think John's point is absolutely important, right? that said, you know, how do you create that inspiration? How do you create that willingness, that interest, that passion to go the extra mile when even the sharing of the aha moment with someone else, right, is just not the same when you're on a, you know, a 2-inch by 2-inch box right on the screen. It's just different, right? So, you know, there's surely some really great thought leaders out there in the HR space who are, you know, really envisioning new ways to inspire and create that, even though we might be, you know, a bunch of little boxes on the Brady Bunch, you know, picture.
As we are experiencing right now. You know, interestingly enough, we, in my firm, because we do a lot of the creative and the innovation stuff, definitely no replacement for that whiteboard. However, one of the interesting things that we are finding is alongside that is just this need or this mechanism of how do you preserve culture. That's a big one when you're doing your 2x2 on the Brady Box screen. So we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and I've got one that I'd like to ask if no one raises their hand or wants to volunteer. Any questions from the audience? Okay, I will ask my question because I know this is really good. I got a chance to talk to you all maybe about a week ago, and we were talking about the big shifts that you see when you compare B2C businesses and B2B businesses. And I know in your respective portfolios, you guys have each. I guess my question is more around what are shifts that you see happening as a result of each of those types of business, whether it's B2C and B2B, and basically what must those types of companies do to adapt?
Yep. I know in our businesses, you know, we manufacture a lot of products and so on that go through a distribution channel that end up in the hands of, say, a contractor, right? So maybe it's appliance control subsystem or something. There's been often on discussions in the past about how we actually reach that contractor, right? Who comes into the distributor to buy, you know, this subsystem and has choices, frankly, right? How do we create a more direct relationship so that they go in demanding our product, not just whatever it is the distributor has on their shelf and so forth. So even the quote B2B businesses are thinking a lot about how to create more of a pull for their products when they're sold through a channel, as opposed to just trying to make the distributor happy with great fill rates and some discounts, right? So I think, you know, that now with contactless and people aren't even going into the distributor, right? Now the professional contractor is going to the websites more of the suppliers and trying to figure out which product to buy. Oh, can I even buy it remotely and so on? So it's really forcing, you know, our B2B companies to be thinking a lot more like B2C companies. So they create that pull or that distribution channel that doesn't rely on the physical distributor in the middle anymore.
Do you see as an extension to that any channel conflict? Because in effect, you're talking about B2B customers doing direct to consumer as an example. Will that create any channel conflict or have you seen any of that already?
Yeah, it definitely has a significant potential to do that, right? And folks are very, you know, careful about creating conflict or, you know, trying to disintermediate and so forth. You know, so they're talking to the distributors about how are you serving your customers these days? Hey, maybe we can drop ship and, you know, if they're a regular customer of yours, maybe you get, you know, some credit for it or something. So trying to keep them in the loop so that they're loyal to us for the product flow that would still go through them. But we don't want to just stand still and have someone else come along and really create that more direct route and so forth. So there's a lot of, you know, good discussions going on and definitely no conclusions yet.
Big balancing act. John, what about you with respect to anything that you see in the difference between B2B and B2C business models?
I'll, on differences in a B2C model, I would say in general, we're being very cautious. You know, I think, you know, trying to predict and big changes, right, because of the channel conflict and those types of things, right? It's it's really hard. So I would say, Trent, it's hard to tell you if there's any really big trend changes there or what we're seeing. We're just trying to be careful, you know, not to make any mistakes there. On B2B companies, though, I do think very clearly, you know, the level of connectivity between you and your customer in demand planning, your acceptance of higher inventory costs, that is absolutely changing faster than we can watch, right? Because people are recognizing, we had such a lean and efficient supply chain, right, globally, that most B2B companies could work a little bit hands off and really have as the primary driver of success working capital, right? Essentially, it's a working capital game, right? I'm a good B2B partner if I'm helping you manage your working capital, I'm managing my working capital, we all win, we're happy. Now, we're faced with the real challenges that, if you have a major supply chain disruption and you kept it so narrow and it was a working capital focus, your B2B customer doesn't have product to sell. And there's nothing, and there's not like there's somewhere else they can go, because more than likely, your competitor was out too. So now it's a game of, all right, how do you have different inventory models, and how are you, frankly, maybe holding more inventory at times, changing your capital structures so that you can support those sort of inventory buys so you can be ready. Definitely seeing those trends change. And some of that, I think, I just tell you, I think some of that is frankly changed because of the consumer experience, right? I mean, let's not, you're in meetings now where people are reacting to the great toilet paper shortage of 2020, right? And strangely enough, that is in their mind when you're having discussions around, a totally unrelated product, but around what you're doing, in your supply chain, to, make it successful so that they can sell your product. People are open to different discussions.
Awesome. Well, John, I would say tons of content there for us to go deeper. We are at time. I know we have one slide of kind of upcoming events and things like that, but did want to take the time to thoroughly thank you and Tom for your awesome insights. So on behalf of Innovate at UCLA and kind of our guests in the university, thank you so much for your contributions today. It's just an awesome set of information. Definitely appreciate it. Really quickly to everyone on the call, in terms of some of our upcoming virtual events, the next one's going to be a social happy hour. Those are always wild. Bring your own bottle and enjoy yourself in the comfort of your own home. We're going to talk a bit about automation on August 27th. And then have a really good session on virtual education coming up on the 17th. With that, guests and audience, John, Tom, again, folks, thank you so much for your time and your participation today, and hope the content and the event was as great for you as it was for us at Innovate at UCLA. Have a good one.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure.
Take care, folks.
Thanks. That was great.
Great job, everybody.